Hi, it's Dwyer. It is August 14th, 2025. GamblersAdvisory.com, a free site. BettingAngle.us, a free site. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Folks, one of the things I love about the internet, before I get into AJ against Jake Paul, one of the things I love about the internet is you get esteemed people, right? In finance, Ray Dalio, Jim Rogers, right? In boxing, Abel Sanchez. Understand, Sanchez, of course, the longtime trainer of Gennady Golovkin. He also trained Hall of Famer Terrible Terry Norris. Right now, he has one of the thoroughbreds of the heavyweight division, Philippe Bergovic, right? Let me point out, Golovkin, under Abel Sanchez's tutelage, fought Canelo twice. He gave an interview where he talks about Canelo being at his gym, who he thinks wins, Canelo Crawford. I've put a link to that video. I believe he's on the money. I've put a link to that video in the description of this one. Please give it a look. Right? Also recognize too that some others, Hall of Famer Tim Bradley, for example, is now leaning toward Terence Crawford. Right? So understand there is a diversity of opinion. Let's just say I appreciate Abel Sanchez's comments. Now let's talk about AJ, and I need for people to understand, and I've said it a million times here on this site, life's unfair. Right? I'm not saying AJ is the world's best heavyweight. I'm not saying that at all. But what I am saying is AJ has a special relationship with the fans. Understand, these things develop. The fighter himself might not be in control of it. But I'm just here to tell you that, right now, AJ, who got dropped several times by Daniel Dubois, is more popular with fans than Daniel Dubois. Right? I'm just telling you that this situation is straight out of earlier eras. In the 1980s, Marvin Hagler was dumbfounded. Dumbfounded. Right? He had beaten Roberto Duran in a 15-round fight. He had stopped Thomas Hearns in 3 rounds. But yet, for some reason, Ray Leonard was more popular than him. Right? Leonard, who struggled with Thomas Hearns, who lost to Duran, who was out of the ring for years, who, because of his Olympic success, had big names come to him, as opposed to Marvin Hagler, who had to cross the Atlantic Ocean to fight Alan Minter to win his title. Look up that fight. Look at the debris thrown in the ring after Hagler stops Minter. Right? Hagler had to do it the hard way. So understand, Ray Leonard was out of the ring for years. I'm not kidding. Look it up. For years. When Ray was to fight Marvin Hagler, Hagler insisted, since he was the reigning middleweight champion, since the fight was for his title, Hagler insisted that he be paid more than Ray Leonard. According to reports, Hagler made $12 million for their 1987 fight. Ray Leonard, who had not been fighting, let me repeat that, who had not been fighting, got $11 million for the fight. Well, let me just say, AJ, whatever has happened, 2 losses to Usyk, which he's been bailed out of, right? Because now some contemporaries, Fury, 2 losses to Usyk, Dubois, 2 losses to Usyk, right? History is going to remember Usyk as a bad man. Well, just understand, today, I would argue that Anthony Joshua is still Britain's favorite heavyweight. And that includes Tyson Fury. That includes the young guy, Moses Atama. The next generation's in the building. That includes Fabio Wardley. Right? AJ is the most popular. Let me tell you how this works, too. You know, we saw Ali legitimately beaten. Folks, the fight's not close. By Joe Frazier. Right? He's beaten by Frazier. We saw Ray Leonard beaten by Roberto Duran. Now, that fight's close, the first one. Right? But the bottom line is Duran, lightweight, comes up to Ray Leonard's division and is cuffing Ray Leonard around. And I'm just telling you that Ali and Ray Leonard, after the loss, may have been even more popular than they were before the loss. Right? Anthony Joshua, you've seen him in his rough moments. That first Andy Ruiz fight, where he gets knocked down, let's remember it, multiple times. Right? The Usyk fight, where that first fight ends, Joshua looks relieved to hear the closing bell. Look at the closing seconds of that 12th round. Right? But there's something about Joshua that makes him a cash cow at the box office. Joshua also has some big wins. I'll say this. Of all the heavyweight fights I've seen in the last, we'll go back, let's say 15 years, probably the event that had the biggest event feeling, right? The most satisfying feeling. You saw the event as it was happening. You knew it was a big event. The fight delivered, had iconic moments. At the end of the fight, you thought, okay, the right guy won this, right? He earned it. There are no gifts. There's no controversy, as there is with Ray Leonard Hagler, was that AJ victory over Vladimir Klitschko. That seemed like a passing of the guard, right? A passing of the torch. Understand that Fury, unbeaten, versus Usyk, unbeaten, fight had some controversy, right? It was close. Fury thought he was robbed, right? During the fight, you were wondering exactly what the referee was doing in that 9th round. The AJ Vladimir Klitschko fight, folks, that's clean, right? If there's someone to blame in that fight for a controversial moment, it's Vladimir Klitschko, who has AJ seemingly dead in the water in front of him. Vladimir lets him off the hook, then AJ comes back. Right? You looked at AJ and you thought, wow, I give AJ credit for coming back. Well, folks, I know there are many who are going to say, well, there was an Olympics in the United Kingdom, and the British fighter won the gold medal. That's why he has this glow. Folks, tell that to Tony Yoka. There are many guys who won Olympic gold who don't have the glow. That's what it is. That Anthony Joshua has. Well, let me let you in on what I think's the secret to outsiders that I believe Joshua himself knows personally. The best Joshua I've seen, and obviously I've been here online for years talking about Joshua fights, right? The best Joshua I've seen is Joshua against Otto Wallin. Folks, that's a recent fight. That's the best Joshua. Folks, that's a stunningly good performance. It's all there. Wallin beat Murat Gassiev. He wasn't chopped liver. Wallin gave Tyson Fury a tough fight. Right? Joshua was not the first world-class fighter Wallin had been in the ring with. Folks, Wallin could move. You see him moving away from Murat Gassiev in that fight. He's pinned by Joshua. Joshua has everything working. His footwork is such that Wallin's up on the ropes. Joshua has ring coverage in that fight. He's throwing a long jab. It's long. Joshua's not near Wallin, and Wallin's a tall man. Right? Joshua lands enough power shots where Wallin, who did not quit against Murat Gassiev, a hard hitter, throws in the towel or retires from his corner against Anthony Joshua. Now, if you believe, as I do, that the Joshua who faced Wallin is the best Joshua, right, folks? He has it all working in that fight. Then what that means is that the Joshua who's fighting, not just Vladimir Klitschko, not just former Olympic gold medalist Alexander Povetkin, not just the Joshua who fights former heavyweight champion Joe Parker, who right now is a mandatory all these years later. That Joshua, when he's popular, when he's a heavyweight champion, was figuring things out. Dare I say, I believe that Joshua loses to the Joshua who beat Otto Wallin. Now, I'll agree, many of you are going to point out, well, that Wallin fight was before his fight against Daniel Dubois. Right, folks? Big punchers only have to be right once. Let's face it, Joshua gets hurt in that fight. Joshua's a soldier. He's not going to talk about his ankle problem in that fight. It's obvious on film. Right? He gets caught early. I'm not taking anything away from Dubois. He gets caught early, but in one of those times when he hits the canvas, it's clear he hurts his ankle. It's clear he can't move. He's not 100%. Now, you and I know boxing has a code. Right? You know, certain fighters won't even acknowledge that a cut has hurt their performance. Right? There's a famous fight where Carmine Basilio has an eye close on him during a fight. And after the fight, all Carmine would say when asked about that eye was that, well, I had my other eye. Right? You and I know that mindset's in boxing. Anthony Joshua is not going to give excuses. He's not going to tell you that he hurt his ankle, that he couldn't move against the puncher, Daniel Dubois. Right? He's not going to tell you that. He got caught early, never recovers, gets injured, comes back. Right? It's an interesting sequence to end that fight. Joshua is going for a stoppage. Unfortunately, Joshua has never been defensively blessed. Right? A Mayweather would have come at Dubois at that moment, whatever happened in the rest of the fight, and would have been thinking about defense and angles. That's the difference between the defensively blessed. Canelo intuitively, because this is who he is, would have had his chin tucked, would have had his neck even shorter than it is, would have come in guarding against a shot to his chin. I don't think that ever crossed Joshua's mind. Joshua comes in. Where does Dubois hit him? One of the worst places imaginable, right? Chin, temple, those are the worst places. Joshua gets caught on the chin, goes down hard. Right? So my point to you is simply this. Heavyweights age more slowly. I know we're talking about retirement and stuff like that, and realistically, if I were a fabulously wealthy guy who had a successful boxing career where I was champ multiple times, and if I got dropped several times in a fight from some young, heavy handed guy like Daniel Dubois, I'd be asking myself, gee, why am I still in this game? I understand there's money on the table, but you and I know, a fighter has to know when to say when. If I were Anthony Joshua, I'd be thinking about, leaving the sport. But understand, I'm someone who doesn't really care that much about legacy, right? I'd be thinking about the south of France, right? I'd be thinking about running the streets. Joshua famously gave advice to a fighter where he told a young guy, look, you have to view fighting like being in the military. You have to devote your life to it for 10 years. Right? Well, I'm the kind of guy who early on would be thinking about the end of the 10 years. Right? My point to you, though, is Joshua is not far removed from peak Joshua. Recognize that. I know he's been playing Russian roulette with trainers, but the bottom line is, if you ask me who is the best Joshua I've seen, I would say it's the guy who fought Otto Wallin. Let me also say, too, you can't tell how sharp a fighter is by his real fights. Joshua, for all we know, could be training hard in the gym. Could be continuing to watch his diet. He might be one of these lifestyle guys. Not a Roberto Duran or a Ricky Hatton who gets in shapes for fights. Rather, this might be the opposite. This might be the in-shape guy who fights. Right? Ray Leonard, look at him. Today, he still looks in shape. Right? Contrast that with James Toney, who doesn't look in shape. Right? You get the feeling Ray Leonard is, like Manny Pacquiao, another guy who's always in shape. You get the feeling Ray Leonard probably has some hobbies. Maybe he jogs. Maybe he plays tennis. Maybe he plays basketball like Manny does. Right? The guys who stay in shape, they have their reflexes. They're aging more slowly than the on the sofa potato chip crowd. Right? They don't need that, signed contract to be in shape. I once heard a Michael Spinks interview where Michael Spinks was basically saying, I was bored, I was looking for action. So I decided to go into this gym in Philly. Of all places, one of the boxing capitals of the United States. I decided to go into this gym and to spar heavyweights. That's the mindset. Right? Joshua might still be prime Joshua. Let's talk about the troubling tape. And we're being picky here. That gives Jake Paul a chance. Right? Otto Wallin moves well. Believe it or not, he doesn't move as well as Jake Paul. Right? All that movement you saw in the Mike Tyson fight from Jake Paul. I need for people to understand that Jake Paul that night was in his 220s. I'm hearing about Jake Paul being a club-level fighter who's 200 pounds. Folks, he's already been in his 220s in a fight. And look at the movement. Judge him off the movement. Now, knockouts cause amnesia. Let me also say, too, scoring, I can't explain it. Right? Let's just say if you have a reputation, if you're Deontay Wilder and you're fighting Luis Ortiz, and not a lot of people know who Luis Ortiz is, and it's the first fight, you're going to be awarded a lot of close rounds that you shouldn't be. Don't look at the scorecards. What I want people to do is to look at the match involving Olympic gold medalist Anthony Joshua against Olympic gold medalist and former heavyweight champion Alexander Povetkin. Revisit that match. Folks, Povetkin has great legs. Povetkin is moving early in that fight, right? He's an ambush fighter. So, what that means is he's outside, he jumps in the pocket. He's not reading you. He's actually able to be faster than you because he has a predetermined punch pattern. Right? This isn't the guy who jumps in the pocket, is reading you. This isn't James Toney, who is in the pocket, he's reading you, then he figures out this guy's unprepared for an uppercut. Starts throwing the uppercut. Right? Is making adjustments. Sees you move as he's leaning his body. And then thinks, this guy's unprotected for a left hook. Right? That's not Povetkin. Who Povetkin is who Jermell Charlo is. I'm just giving you my views. Right? It's who David Haye was. This is the guy who's outside and who thinks to himself, I'm going to come in, I'm going to throw a left hook, then I'm going to throw a right cross. Then I'm going to get out of the pocket. Right? It's hit and run boxing. So understand, he's outside, he jumps in the pocket, he throws a combination, he jumps back out. On Anthony Joshua, who's cautious, who is engaged in pattern recognition. Right? Who likes to feel you out, who's tentative early in fights. Right? This is the opposite of Nigel Benn. Right? This is the guy who, even though he is blessed in terms of punching power in both hands, this is the cautious guy. Right? This is the guy on the highway who's looking around, who's driving 60 miles an hour. Right? This isn't Dale Earnhardt on the road. So, let me just say, AJ, Jake Paul, there's no title at stake. It's not a 12-round fight. It would be a 10-round fight, wouldn't it? Right? Early in the fight, Jake Paul would have the hand speed advantage. If Jake Paul can dodge Joshua's jab, which Povetkin did, jump in like Povetkin, throw some punches and then get back out. If he can force Joshua to come looking for him, folks, slow starter Joshua is not going to get going until the third or fourth round. You spot Jake Paul 3 rounds in a 10-round fight, and you're flirting with danger. Right? You're flirting with danger. So let me just say, I'm going to save an actual prediction for this fight for my premium subscribers. I believe Joshua is a future Hall of Famer. I believe Joshua is blessed not just power, but length. I believe if Joshua shows up on his A game, he's going to be a force to be reckoned with. But what I want people to grasp, and I know there's a lot of pride in boxing, I know the last thing we want to believe is that a guy can be a YouTuber and then can actually be in the ring fighting former heavyweight champs like Tyson, Anthony Joshua, and competitive. Right? I know we don't want to believe that a guy with a public persona of a jester, right? Let's face it, Jake Paul is Flavor Flav. Right? Jake Paul is, Jorge Paez, if you remember him. Right? We don't want to believe that that guy could actually challenge future Hall of Famers. We don't want to believe that. There's a big difference between Jake Paul fighting Nate Diaz and Jake Paul fighting Anthony Joshua. But let's stop kidding ourselves, folks. Jake Paul, as I've said here, and understand, I'm not on Team MVP. I'm not sponsored by Jake Paul. I'm just a boxing guy. I'm just a guy looking to bet on sporting events. That's all. Right? And if I'm looking to bet on sporting events, I have to actually see what's in front of me. Jake Paul has an A level right hand. Let's give him at least that. Something hard hit Nate Robinson. Right? Something hard hit Ben Askren. He has an A level right hand. Let me also say, too, this is a guy, and I don't care about the public persona. Understand, boxing's replete. You know, I mentioned Paez. He was one of my favorite fighters. The guy was dangerous in the ring. But before a fight, of course, he's clowning. In the 70s, we understood as Ali was clowning. We understood he was a bad man in the ring. This was a guy who could beat Foreman. Right? We didn't know that before the fight, but let's say he fought Foreman and beat him. This was a guy who could get his jaw broken by Kenny Norton. Continue to fight with a broken jaw. Couldn't even close his mouth. In a fight he lost. Go the distance. Right? Think about that. He was playing the clown. That's who Jake Paul is. Right? Take him seriously. Let me also say, too, you know, Jake Paul weighed more in his Tyson fight than I believe Joe Frazier or Ali weighed for their first fight. Right? Look up Rocky Marciano. Look up Ezzard Charles. Folks, there are many excellent heavyweights. Jack Dempsey, excellent heavyweights, who had title fights weighing less than Jake Paul weighed for his fight against Mike Tyson. Also, don't be overwhelmed by height. How tall was Andy Ruiz when he beat Anthony Joshua? Dwight Braxton, Dwight Cowie, is a Hall of Famer. Folks, I'm not sure if I ever saw Cowie being the taller man in a fight. Right? You got a lot of guys who parlay their lack of height. Marciano would actually fight low, and he was shorter than most of his opponents. Certainly he's shorter than Joe Louis. Right? And so, all I'm saying is, the Jake Paul AJ fight deserves your attention. There is a distinct possibility that AJ shows up and he's dominant. But let's be clear here. Francis Ngannou, early KO for AJ, is right in front of him. Charles Martin, early KO for AJ, is right in front of him. Andy Ruiz, first fight, early knockdown for AJ, he's right in front of him. Jake Paul has clearly worked on his craft. He doesn't have the legs he had today against Nate Robinson. Look at that fight. Right? Look at Jake Paul's early fights. And it's been years, by the way. Right? Let's stop acting like Jake Paul just, walked out of a dressing room and for the first time hit a boxing ring last week. No. Jake Paul has been in the game for years. Most of his opponents have been overmatched. He just fought a former champion, Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. And think about it. Chavez Jr.'s strategy was to have that fight go a few rounds. His strategy, this is a former boxing champion, was to wait out Jake Paul. Right, folks? If Jake Paul is enough of a problem, right? If the problem child is enough of a problem for former champions to think, okay, I've got to let this guy control the pacing for the first 3 rounds in a 10-round fight. Right? If you're conceding the first third of the fight to Jake Paul, then Jake Paul is certainly bringing something. Right? So the paradox, and it is a paradox, to Anthony Joshua is Joshua looks like one of boxing's better athletes. You see Joshua, he's coordinated. Right? He has a jab. He certainly is one of boxing's biggest punchers. Right? But this isn't George Foreman. Right? This isn't Mike Tyson. In other words, Joshua doesn't go for early stoppages. Joshua lets the fight unfold, doesn't he? You have to be right in front of him for Joshua to open up. Right? If you have movement, it starts to throw him off. Right? So just understand this fight's going to have different parts to it. Right? The early rounds, Joshua's not going to come across the ring as I hoped Mike Tyson was going to. I thought Tyson was going to destroy Jake Paul. Right? Young Tyson, had foot speed, had attitude. Marvis Frazier has little chance of getting off the ropes. Right? You look at Joshua, who's big, who is an athlete, and you say clearly he's going to treat this little man like he's a little man. Well, understand the little man might be who gives him problems. Right? Isn't the little man Steve Cunningham, Alexander Usyk? Isn't it the smaller, more coordinated heavyweight who gives Tyson Fury problems? Right? The little man who can move, who's hard to find, who can jump in ambush style. Jake Paul can throw combinations. Jump in, throw combinations, keep moving. Have you looking at your own personal CompuBox numbers and saying, wow, Jake Paul landed more punches than AJ that first round. You and I know this is a distinct possibility on fight night. Jake Paul landed more punches than AJ the first round. Jake Paul landed more punches than AJ the second round. Jake Paul landed more punches than AJ the third round. Right now, is AJ the kind of guy who's then going to shorten the ring? I've seen the fight happen. Let's name it. Dillian White. Right? Is AJ the guy who can then make the ring smaller after he figures out the lay of the land? Come inside and start throwing on a guy. He's done it before. But understand, if this Jake Paul fight makes it to the 4th or 5th round, and if you're watching the fight and AJ has to come out of his shell and actually start throwing big shots, the fight will have delivered from a boxing drama perspective. Right? So let me just say, if I were AJ, I'm not sure I'd take the fight. Right? My attitude would be, hey, I'm a multiple heavyweight champion. I'm an Olympic gold medalist. I have a legitimate big fight if Joe Parker regains the heavyweight title. AJ, Joe Parker, folks, both of them are so much better than they were the first time they fought. AJ, of course, won that first fight. That AJ Joe Parker fight would be high drama. High drama. Let's talk about another fight. If Moses Atama is as advertised, and that's an open question, right? I haven't seen him in the later rounds of a fight. The guys who Atama has fought, sometimes you have to look them up. You're like, who's this guy? Then you're there looking it up, right? If Moses Atama beats Dillian White, wow, an Atama AJ fight, that's legit, isn't it? Isn't Atama already a mandatory contender for one of these titles? AJ has legitimate fights, and I'm just telling you, when you're a Ray Leonard, when you're a Pacquiao, when you're an Anthony Joshua, right? If you're fighting credible opposition, number one contender, Moses Atama, right? Number one contender, Joe Parker. You're going to get tens of thousands of fans. If I'm AJ, I'm not sure if I'd fight Jake Paul. My point to you, though, is simply Jake Paul is real. A Jake Paul AJ fight would have drama. Let's stop trying to prove to the world that YouTubers can't become championship level boxers. Because that's who AJ is that's who Jake Paul is right now. Now I'm not saying he beats Gilberto Ramirez, right, who I consider to be a future Hall of Famer. I'm not saying he beats J.O. Pataya, right? The top at cruiser is high up. But folks, just like Usyk came to the heavyweight division and in this big clunky heavyweight era is too mobile for many of these big guys, right? Isn't he feasting on guys 6'5", 6'6", 6'9", right? Aren't those the guys he's feasting on? Understand, this era's unusual. While you have had some heavyweight champions, Primo Carnera, right, who were big guys, right? Just understand, a Lennox Lewis looked huge when he fought. Now he's just a face in the crowd. This Vladimir Klitschko, Lennox Lewis, Vitaly Klitschko, Deontay Wilder, Anthony Joshua, Tyson Fury era, folks, that's new. Most of these guys in history weren't that big, right? Usyk's actually bigger than Sonny Liston. At some point, you have to ask yourself, does the height lead to less coordination? Does the height lead to less hand speed? Is it possible that a more coordinated guy can keep one of these big sluggers at bay long enough to pile up points on a judge's scorecard to the point where you get to the closing rounds of the fight and we all start thinking, does the bigger fighter need a knockout to win the fight? That scenario could easily play itself out in a Jake Paul, Anthony Joshua fight, right? So I'll just say this, the fight's competitive, right? Let me add a caveat. Anthony Joshua is a future Hall of Famer. Maybe the public is underselling, as I did, Jake Paul, right? I thought Tyson would walk through him, right? Maybe the secret to Jake Paul is that a Dwight Braxton, a prime Mike Tyson, not a 50-something-year-old Mike Tyson, right? Maybe the secret to Jake Paul is that those guys would go through him. I believe J.O. Pataya destroys him because I believe there's no foot speed advantage that Jake Paul would have. Jake Paul wouldn't have a hand speed advantage on J.O. Pataya. Opatai is advanced. He comes in, he's playing with his hands. You can't tell his movement. You can't tell when he's going to jump in the pocket. Right? Maybe it takes a smaller, more coordinated guy in his prime to beat Jake Paul. But the corollary is that a seasoned, experienced, bigger fighter with slower hand speed, who Jake Paul can stay away from as the guy loads up on shots. A guy with a powerful jab that might be ponderous to a smaller guy with quicker feet and reflexes. Right? The same way Steve Cunningham baffled Fury for rounds. Right? Let's stop pretending that that fight's just, Cunningham landing a knockdown punch. Right? Maybe Jake Paul can do the same thing to Anthony Joshua. Right? The fight's competitive, folks. Let's see what happens. If I'm Joshua, I'd avoid it. Little upside. Right? If he wins, we're all going to say, gee, he beat a YouTuber. Right? People aren't going to give Paul the credit he deserves. Right? If he wins, people are going to say, well, Tommy Fury beat Jake Paul. Right? I'm just telling you that Jake Paul's a different fighter than the one who fought Tommy Fury. Right? Don't fall for the act. Right? Jake Paul is literally like Ali. Shows up, is acting the fool, is reaching for Howard Cosell's toupee, is, cracking jokes and, knows the reporters, can call the reporter out by name and stuff like that. The bottom line is, the Ali in the ring was a guy who, could fight the Thriller in Manila. Right? Could go 14 hard rounds against Joe Frazier. Right? Jake Paul could play the fool all he wants. I believe there's a tough guy in Jake Paul. I think Jake Paul isn't silly enough to decide to try to trade in the pocket with Anthony Joshua. I think his strategy is going to be to move for the first few rounds. Unlike the Canelo-Crawford fight, which is 12 rounds, a Jake Paul-AJ fight would likely be 10 rounds. So understand, if Crawford comes out as Abel Sanchez thinks he's going to, and has too much speed for Canelo early, as Cal Brooks, smaller man, did against Sanchez's fighter, Golovkin, those first 2-3 rounds, right? Understand, in the AJ Jake Paul fight, a third of the fight's going to be gone. Right? AJ is going to be forced to have to be aggressive. Maybe he treats Jake Paul like he treated Dillian Whyte, one of his best fights. Maybe he is sharp from the opening bell as he was against Otto Wallin. Right? There's also that possibility that he runs out of time. We've forgotten Leon Spinks, Ali, the first fight that Ali lost, right, to a smaller man like Jake Paul who was more coordinated. Take a look at that fight. Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours in the comments section of this YouTube video. I know I have many subscribers who feel Jake Paul's a joke. Right, folks? The Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. fight, understanding that Chavez Jr. fought Canelo at a catch weight that didn't favor him. The catch weight favored Canelo and went the distance against him. Right? Let's, all I'm saying to you is, don't you think that if you're good enough to go the distance against Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., don't you think if you're good enough for Chavez Jr. to have a strategy of, I'm going to give away the early rounds, hoping to get to the later rounds in a 10-round fight, where I can then finish this guy, only to find out in the later rounds that Jake Paul still had stamina. Don't you think if an opponent is leading a champion to that game plan, don't you think that opponent is bringing at least something to the table? Let me hear from you in the comment section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.